The Chicago Longitudinal Study that I got involved in, I came in as an evaluator 1985, and I learned early childhood education from two former kindergarten teachers, very dear friends of mine, Nancy Marvin Jensen, Mavis Hageman, and so they taught me the ropes about early childhood. I came in as an evaluator, and so I didn't design the program, although the scale up, we did design and redesign the CPC program. But my comments are really about the CLS study, from the sort of the data review and the analysis, and then over time, I just took over the project around 1990, but it was an in-house project at Chicago Public Schools. Long history, but it's a really unique history of being an in-house project that turned into a big project. And so here's some lessons that, the first 7 lessons I thought about, and I want to just go through just a few of these. And obviously the school quality one I'll get to as well. So you can read those, but there is no perfect program, and I think this is based, some of it's on just the learning of things as a program developer. I know what Craig feels like a little bit as a program developer as we redefined and redesigned the CPC program. This idea of it's a hothouse, I think you're right, that there's a lot of things you have to figure out in the real world regardless of what the program is. But there is no perfect program as CPC, and here's a good example. This isn't the same designation as Larry had as well, but these are head teacher reports with the evaluators. They're retrospective reports about whether the preschool instruction was teacher-directed or child-initiated or some combination. And it's a relative framework, and so, for example, kids in low teacher, high child, that wasn't free play. It was directed, but just it's relatively teacher-initiated or child-initiated versus teacher-directed. I want to direct you to the lower part. This idea that we have the same impact or that every kid gets the same quality of program, I don't think is true, because as you see here, the percentage of our sample, the 989 that got CPC, 176 were in classrooms that head teachers rated to be low on teacher-directed and low on child-initiated. Now, what that means is basically custodial. There was no distinct instructional strategy or philosophy that was being implemented. Some of it could be custodial, or there was no defined curricula that really we could understand that those kids were getting. And that was, almost 20% of the sample. So obviously, there's a challenge here. In any program, I think 100% of kids, they don't get the same program, and not necessarily, they're not benefiting from the same program in the same way. Some kids, you need to have optimized sort of learning experiences. And what we found in looking long-term, that kids certainly in the high group, and that would be consistent, I think, with Larry's point, that we found the kids that were in these high teacher-directed, high child-initiated, or just high child-initiated, that they had the best outcomes long-term of the other kids. So obviously there is no perfect program, so even the best of intentions, not every kid is going to get necessarily the highest quality configuration in the program. But our goal should be, it's a regulated ideal. We could get better. But despite this, the findings were still strong. The other thing, second point, is to learn, and we were using those lessons for the new project too. So Big Ten approaches can work. And I think this is a lot to handle, I guess, in describing this. It's a Big Ten program. There's a principal, there's a head teacher in preschool, kindergarten, there's a head teacher in the elementary school. You've got all these services. You're trying to do this for 6 consecutive years. There's a lot. It's an implementation science question. Can you manage and organize, from a leadership perspective, a program with a lot of components, and the trains have to go together on time? There's got to be strong coordination. The only way it really works that we have found is in a strong leadership. You've got to have a strong principal, and you've got to have a strong leadership team. So in the CPC model, that means a strong head teacher, parent resource teacher, and SCR in each site. With that, it can work, but there's a lot of things certainly that can go wrong. In the new model, the same thing. It's a Big Tent program. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of elements. There's a lot of staff involved. You could implement it well, and it's really, the synergy works. If you don't implement it well, it's a train wreck. And so I think that it can be, and so that's the idea. But we have found, certainly the evidence shows that this can work. This can be effective. You can never have enough data. I learn about this every day. And I think I just want to go back in history and time because I think about these findings we've shown on both child maltreatment, and I know I compare and Epstein, and they haven't looked at child maltreatment, but I think we were working internally, and here's the advantage. So we were looking at this as a school project and looking at achievement outcomes, but then we figured out we got a recommendation to talk to the juvenile court in Cook County, and they let us go in. And we didn't look at this as a preventive of delinquency or of child maltreatment, but we had this open opportunity to go in manually. We went into the juvenile courts and got to look up individual case records of everyone in our sample, 1539, to see if they were present at a juvenile court petition or they were in the family court in terms of a DCF or a substantiated, in Illinois it's called indicated child maltreatment. Now our opportunity to have this data, we never thought. It was like it's really an issue about just the serendipity of getting this access, and it was because we were connected, we were working in-house in the Chicago Public Schools. Any other external partner, it would have been impossible to get this data. Now, later on, you could get this data through Chapin Hall or some of it in some way, but we used it to find that obviously we wanted to look at this because of the family support hypothesis, really, because CPCs, what they do better generally than Head Start does is more intensive parent involvement and more intentional parent involvement because each site has a strong team in place to have parent involvement, and there's a parent resource room in every center. So because of that theory of the program and the focus of the program, we wanted to look at both child maltreatment, substantiated child maltreatment, and juvenile arrest, and we found significant similar effects on both. And the juvenile delinquency effect moved into adulthood as well. I'm not showing those, but that's the other thing. And then the other thing is, I just want to point out findings. You never stop data collection. Perry F's area know about this. A 50. I can't really think that we could do a age 50 follow-up right now. But age 35 follow-up, some of the benefits are, if you do the hard work of getting the data. Most of this data comes from the National Student Clearinghouse. With we're doing an age 35 follow-up right now. But this is sort of hot off the press, our initial analysis of the age 35 findings on educational attainment using administrative data from the National Student Clearinghouse, and this is with Suru and others on the CLS team as well, that we find what we haven't been able to really look at very much. We haven't had good data on really degree completion. So we're seeing that years of education, and this controls for later intervention, but what we find is the continuing effect on years of education is sort of an anomalous thing, just years not looking at degree. But if you look at college attendance, we find an effect. We don't find a difference on BA degree. So the percentage of the preschool group or the comparison group, there's no significant difference, but it favors the program group, and we're trying to better understand it. If you look at AA and BA together, we do see a difference, that 6-point difference. It's not a small effect. But in general, the percentage of our sample that's going on and getting a degree, it's pretty small. And I think, but compared to low-income inner-city, residents in Chicago, that's 17%. Probably isn't that different. It's probably higher than it would be, if we looked at the general population in those neighborhoods as well. But obviously, there's room to grow there. So there's never enough data you can look at, but sometimes the data looks really interesting when you get it, and that's sort of an example. The other thing we looked at, just correlation, just to give you just a point of information. So we looked at the correlations, again, with this is with years of education and BAA degree, based on sort of this cognitive advantage hypothesis we thought about earlier as well. And we looked at correlations, and this is using the ITBS achievement data, showing that this early cognitive composite, that's not where the highest correlation with age 35 educational attainment is. It's really, at age 14. So I have this idea of this, the primacy of, cognition early at age 5, I think gives a better understanding here. This achievement profile is really ultimately a much better predictor of educational attainment. And so you can see this as well. So that's just some descriptive data. Don't underestimate the critical mass. This is the idea, we've talked about the meta-analysis, Greg Duncan's meta-analysis done in early childhood, obviously Greg Camilli. There's a lot of evidence from meta-analysis that shows that there is a benefit. There is a benefit to preschool. And that critical mass, and we sometimes dwell too much on individual studies, so I think we have to look really to the critical mass to inform our policy making. I just want to point out, one thing is the critical mass. Well, let's look across the 3 studies and do we find similar answers? And here, if I look across the 3 studies, that say 3 studies together or 5, 10, 20 is better than 1 study. And so the idea here is just selected effects on well-being. I'm looking at sort of effect sizes of those 3 programs, about in the same range, a little bit higher in peri and abecedary, and I think there was a little more intensity in those programs. But really, the differences in special ed were nearly identical, a little bit larger effects in abecedarian, and the reading effect size, that has some controls in it, control variables in it, so it's not exactly the same number that Larry showed, but shows that consistency. So it gets to this importance of the critical mass. Age 21, educational attainment, years of education by age 21, the same thing. And that there is a large consistency among these projects that differ in really the scope of the programs. I think are same concepts, but they're different programs, different geographies, obviously, different time periods, but they're showing that consistency, and that gets to the critical mass. Now, we could add in the consortium studies, we could add in data from IHDP, lots of other studies. I think you'd get some comparability here, okay? And I'm going to skip that over. So this is main effects really are the interactions and processes. That's, Yuri Bronfenbrenner used to say the main effects, the real effects of the interactions. So, but it's also about process. I showed this process before, but I just wanted to, the only point I would show, because obviously, like all 3 programs, they showed an effect on school achievement at age 14. So the idea here is that there is a main effect. There was a sustained effect on age 14 achievement test scores. Now, what accounts for that sustained effect? And here, it's a very consistent, picture. It was those cognitive skills. Now, those cognitive skills may be made up of, there may be a motivational component in there, which I think there is. On the other hand, too, there's somewhat of a carryover to academic motivation, and so this idea of this mutual reinforcement hypothesis, which I think is reminiscent of the consortium studies, is present there as well. Okay? And I'm going to skip over that one. The other thing I want to point out is just that in our study, this interaction effects. So we find the outcomes in adulthood, they differ depending on certain characteristics of families. So if we look at neighborhood poverty, for example, and this is work history, did they get a degree, an AA or more, or did they have 2 or 3 years of consistent work history at age 27? The effect of the program, the preschool program in CPC, was larger if those kids were from the highest poverty neighborhoods in Chicago. And there was essentially no effect if they were from lower poverty neighborhoods. And if parents graduated or didn't have a high school credential, that the effect of the program was larger. So the greater effects for the most disadvantaged within CPC, lesser effects before. So that's this idea of the main effects of interaction. It's a really interesting pattern. School quality, so get ready for this diagram here. So all I want to show you here is that the idea that school quality matters, controlling for everything, whether the kids attended a magnet or high-quality school here, had a direct effect on arrest petitions. More years of attendance in higher quality magnet schools or high-quality schools, less likely attendance, controlling for everything that you could imagine, okay, in a path model. And obviously, school support hypothesis is part of the process. Same thing for on-time graduation. Attended a high-quality school, a direct effect on on-time graduation, and of course it mediates the effect of CPC extended participation. But the idea here is that school quality in the CLS study makes a big difference. But we had a lot of, good measurement. The challenge was that kids, started in preschool and they ended up going to 300 or 400 different schools, and there's just a huge process of change that you have to sort of examine. But direct evidence that school quality makes a big difference. Now, another new data, this is sort of hot off the press too, just descriptively, this question of follow-on services. So the question is, do years of school-age services matter by age 35? Now, this is just for information. Now, I should just point out, if you look at achievement test scores, we did find evidence that more years of school age, if you go from 1 to 2 to 3, you do get an increment on school achievement. But let's have the metric be, age 35 educational attainment. Did those children grow up and get an AA or a BA? So when you got a huge amount of data like we have, you can look at these questions, and you can't look at these in other kinds of projects. We also had the sample size to look at these questions. So kids started in preschool, so you could go from preschool and you got this program up to grade 1, and then it ended, you moved. Or you could get it to 2nd grade or to 3rd grade. And obviously the goal is that you would hypothesize that kids from preschool, got the program from preschool to 3rd grade, would get the biggest benefits. So did that happen for these 3 outcomes? And for years of educational attainment, again, this is by age 35, there was an increment from 1 to 2, but there was no difference between those that got CPC to 2nd grade versus 3rd grade for years of education. Now, there was an increment, sort of a stair-step relationship for high school graduation. The percent high school graduation, that's a degree, a diploma, and so GEDs are counted 0 here, and that goes up in increments. So some evidence that, and this is significant, so if you had 1 year, graduation rate was 47%, 2 years, 58%, all the way through and got the whole P3 program, 65%. So some positive evidence there. On degree completion, though, there tends to be sort of a threshold. Again, they're based on that metric. The 2 and 3, grade 2 and 3 groups were identical. There was no difference as well. And for some achievement outcomes, we find the same thing. So the question is, in this P3 world, it gets back to sort of the cost question we talked about yesterday. If the evidence shows that you don't get an additional benefit that last year of the P3 program, if you get the same benefits through 2nd grade, and that 3rd year doesn't add much value, do you still implement that program? Of course, you could refine it. Maybe it just reflects an implementation question. But that is a point that we could use data on this to inform that question. And for us, it's clear because in our CPC project, we're now entering the 2nd grade year. And so we can make decisions about the 3rd grade year now and say, well, at the end of the 2nd grade year, at the end of June, should we implement the same program if there's limited financial resources and the evidence suggests that maybe we need to change it in some way? Should we use that decision? We have the power to do that. And I guess from an evaluation perspective, though, I got to check with Donna Spiker, though, before we make any decisions about the program in the 3rd grade year. And hopefully none of our districts are here today. So, but we're not. But I'm just saying that that's the kind of evidence you want to use, and it's consistent with sort of the monitoring theme that Sharon and Craig also mentioned. Last thing, so translation is a science. I think we tend to think of it as an extra feature of research, but I think, and Larry made this point earlier about the cost-benefit analysis. Clearly, the benefits are there for CPC. I would add something a little bit different in the CLS project. And the idea, Art likes to use this internal rate of return. You could use the cost-benefit ratio or just the benefits minus costs, this idea of the internal rate of return. The annual and Rob both in Art use this as an internal rate of return. So what's the annualized rate of return that you get in preschool, 1st to 3rd grade, PK3, that obviously it's greater than 0. And here it's a big investment return. And I think it's consistent with both Perry and Apis-Darian to some extent. But the other thing we can drill down further is that is translation that's made a big difference. But we can also drill down for us into the subgroups. I haven't really presented this very much. But we look at the overall, but we have a large sample, obviously, and we can look at the subgroup effects. And what it shows when you drill down further, obviously, is that certainly if you just look at preschool, and obviously these effects are also can be looked at as extended. The extended comparison is a little bit different, so they're not comparable. It's extended versus less extended. And so they're not really comparable between the two. But if you just take a look at preschool, obviously most of the benefits that we see, like on educational attainment or earnings, is males. And so the cost-benefit ratio for males is out of sight higher than it is for females. And this was reported in our age 26 cost-benefit analysis in child development, 2011. And if you look at so the higher risk kids are getting the bigger benefit. Parents who didn't graduate from high school are getting a much larger bang for the buck in the program. And same with high risk, low risk, and it's the same with high poverty, low poverty. So I think this idea of translation And the idea here may be to take this evidence and say, well, for certain subgroups, and you could do this particular outcomes, why aren't we achieving the same benefits for some subgroups that we are from others? So it's back to sort of the progress monitoring, implementation science that I think theme that we can look at that as well. Why didn't the program have as big as an impact on females? And we saw this very early because the cognitive advantage or the scholastic advantage was much greater for boys in the beginning than it was for girls. Not that there weren't impacts for females, but the increment was much larger for boys. And I think it's maybe partly the starting point, or maybe that the intervention, the more responsiveness or more services need to be provided for males. And these are generally, African American males, boys coming into preschool for the first time. And so those are some of the themes. Those are some of the things that we've learned along the way, and I think the goal of all our lessons is to apply these lessons to new projects and scale up in policy efforts, and I think that is going to be our plan. So thank you very much.